Welcome to another geology lecture for Chapter 9, Folds, Faults, and Geologic Maps. This is your instructor, Kara Kavakis, and in today's lecture, we're going to be looking at 3 different types of stress. We're also going to describe the differences between different types of deformation, elastic, brittle, and ductile. We're going to define cratons and orogens. We're also going to look at the strike and dip of rock layers. We will define and describe synclines, anticlines, and other types of folds. And then we'll take a minute to look at the differences between topographic maps and geologic maps. So let's get started. There are 4 types of stress that can be applied to rocks, 3 of which are unidirectional, which means that they take place in only one direction. And the 4th type is just known as pressure. Unidirectional stress takes place in only one direction and changes the shape but not the volume of the material. When pressure is applied, this means it's a type of stress where the rock is subjected to equal stress in all directions, and this changes the volume but not the shape of the rock. This type of stress is common in the mantle. The 3 types of unidirectional stress include tensional stress, which is stress that pulls an object apart. When tensional stress is applied, the rock body is elongated in the direction of the stress and thinned in other directions. And with enough stretching, the rock itself will break or fault. Compressional stress squeezes the rock together, causing it to fold or fracture. By compressing the rock material, it is shortened across that plane, but it thickens in the other plane. The 3rd type of stress is known as shear stress, and in this slide it's the image on the far right. Shear stress is directed parallel on the plane on which it operates. When shear stress is applied, it acts to distort the shape of the object, similar to the behavior at a transform plate boundary. These types of stresses are all forces that can be applied to the rock. When stress is applied to a rock, strain is the way that the rock responds. So how do rocks respond to this stress? Well, it depends on the temperature, the rate of deformation, the composition of the rock, and the amount of confining pressure applied. One response that a rock can have to stress is to undergo elastic deformation. When this occurs, the change in the shape or volume of the rock is temporary. When the stress is removed, the rock returns to its original shape. This type of rock behavior is only common in low-stress situations. The material bounces back. It's behaving elastically. A second type of rock response is ductile deformation. When a rock layer deforms ductily, it is a permanent but gradual change in the shape or volume of the material, and when the stress is removed, the deformation is permanent. This requires either high stress, high temperature, or high pressure. The more water that is present in a rock layer, the more ductile the rock will behave. A 3rd type of response to stress is a brittle response. And brittle deformation causes a permanent change in the shape or volume because the material itself breaks or cracks. Under an applied stress, the rock fractures or breaks. This can occur at low temperatures and pressures, but with high stresses, or with quick high stress applied. This means that the rocks are quite brittle and breakable. So where in the North American continent would we find deformed rocks? This map shows how the center of the North American continent is made up of cratons. Cratons are regions of the continental crust that have remained tectonically stable for a very long time. Between these cratons are elongated regions of crust that have been deformed and metamorphosed through a continental collision. These long, narrow areas are called orogens. The orogens are made up of deformed metamorphic rocks that are slightly younger than the cratons. You may notice that these rocks, shown in the image above, are between 1 and 2 billion years old. Why haven't they eroded away completely in this time? We know that the powers of erosion can flatten a land surface over time. Well, that is because These rocks are being uplifted by what is known as isostatic rebound, or isostasy. What is isostasy? Well, it's the flotational balance of the lithosphere on the astenosphere. As surface material is removed through erosional processes, it takes some of the weight off the root of the origin that is floating on the astenosphere. With the removal of this weight, the origin can rebound or rise as it continues to float. This explains why extremely old mountain ranges are still in existence on our surface today. Let's talk a little bit more about how structural geology helps us better understand the world around us. Structural geology is the study of the processes causing stress or strain, as well as the deformation in rock structures that result from this stress and strain. We can study the rock structures formed by these processes and use that information to describe the tectonic history of a location. Geologists use many tools in studying these structures, including the strike and dip of rock layers. In the right-hand image, you can see an artist's rendering of tilted sedimentary layers. You can see different layers of limestone, sandstone, and even shale represented in this image. You can also see that these layers are no longer horizontal, even though, according to the law of original horizontality, these layers must have been laid down in a horizontal fashion. So something must have caused them to become at an angle. We can use the information in this image to see how much of an angle it has been tilted. The strike is defined as the compass orientation of the line of intersection between a completely horizontal plane and a planar feature, like that tilted rock layer. The strike on this slide is shown with this arrow right here. The dip is the angle between the tilted surface and that horizontal plane. And as you can see, these layers are tilted at what has been measured to be a 30-degree dip angle. The strike, again, is the compass orientation of the line of intersection between the horizontal plane and this planar feature. The dip, then, is the angle between the tilted surface and the horizontal plane. You can see that represented graphically in this image. Now, when we are looking at different fault behaviors, we talk about the hanging wall and the foot wall and how these two objects behave with respect to one another. The hanging wall is a crustal block that lies above an inclined fault plane. The foot wall is a crustal block that lies below that inclined fault plane. In this image, the fault plane is illustrated in red, and it is an imaginary plane that separates these two crustal blocks. Along this fault plane is where all displacement will occur. So let's look at the two versions of the hanging wall. You can clearly see that it is above the fault plane in this image as well as this image. The foot wall is below the inclined plane in this image and in this image as well. And this may sound kind of silly, but the way I remember it is that the hanging wall looks like you could hang something off the top of it, like you can almost imagine a clothing hanger. And the foot wall, since it has its big toe sticking out, looks like you could put a shoe on it. Honestly, this is how I've remembered the hanging wall and the foot wall for the past 20 years. This is a more traditional image at left of a structural geology diagram, along with the diagram of the faults that we used earlier. You can see that the fault plane, the hanging wall, and the foot wall are all identified, and it's also easy to find the fault scarp, which is the expression of the fault, a cliff formed by the movement along a fault plane. Now there are three main types of fault behavior that we will look at. Here's the first type, normal faulting. This occurs when the hanging wall moves downward relative to the foot wall. Normal faulting is associated with tensional stress. That's the one where it's being pulled apart. When normal faulting occurs along large areas of land, you can create even more interesting surface features covered on the next slide. This is known as Horst and Graben topography. The horsts are the hill-like features, the footwalls, and the grabens are the hanging wall pieces that move downward with respect to the footwalls, because this is normal fault behavior. Now this animation shows the formation of Horst and Graben topography. Now you can see that the hanging walls are moving downward with respect to the foot walls. Now another type of faulting that we study in structural geology is a reverse fault or a thrust fault. Compressive stresses produce these two types of faults, where the hanging wall moves upward relative to the foot wall. This type of compressional stress causes the hanging wall to ride up over the foot wall. A thrust fault tends to move over the foot wall as opposed to upward relative to the foot wall. Shear stresses are directed parallel on the plane on which they operate, and these create strike-slip faulting. Strike-slip faulting movement is primarily horizontal along the plane. The most well-known example of a strike-slip fault is the San Andreas Fault. Now, structural geology does not just include faulting. We can also experience folding of rock layers. Now, folds are bends in the rock that are typically produced by compressive stress. Remember, compressive means being pushed together. And you'll get a fold instead of a fault when the rock itself is acting in a ductile manner, meaning it's more likely to bend than to be brittle. Rocks are usually weakened or worn when this type of deformation occurs, and this typically occurs more often at depth where temperature and pressures are high. Any folds found at Earth's surface indicate that the area has been uplifted, and much of the crust on top of the area has been eroded away in order to expose the folds below. Now there are three main elements of fold geography. There's the axial plane, which is the imaginary plane that divides a fold into two parts. There's also a fold axis, a line formed by the axial plane and the top of the fold. And then each limb is the part of the fold on opposite sides of the axial plane. Now folds where the layers are concaved upwards are known as synclines. When synclines occur, the younger rocks are at the center. Now folds where the strata are concave downwards are known as anticlines. The rock strata at the center are the oldest rocks in this case. Now domes and basins are other interesting geologic structures that are created when large areas are deformed through either upwarping or downwarping. Domes are caused by bending upward, and the oldest layers are at the center. Basins are caused by downward bending, and the youngest layers are at the center. Now let's take just a minute or two to talk about geologic maps. There are two main types of maps that we'll talk about today: geologic maps and topographic maps. Geologic maps represent the rock features that are exposed at the surface, at an outcrop, and these include the types of rocks, the orientation of the rock layers, like the strike and dip, as well as the presence of any structural components like folding or faulting. Here's an example of how a geologic map would be created. By looking at the parts of the surface where the rocks are exposed, in the outcrop at left, you can identify the different rock layers or strata. You can see some sandstone overlain by limestone and shale. Where the rock outcrop is covered by vegetation at the surface or any other structure, it is necessary to infer or extrapolate the location of the rock layers based on what is exposed. You can also use this information to identify the strike and the dip of these layers. Notice how the strike is parallel to the contacts on the map. The geologic map, then, shows each of the layers represented by a different shaded pattern, as well as the unique strike and dip of each layer. Now, topographic maps are slightly different. A topo map is a two-dimensional representation of three-dimensional surface features. They show the shape of a ground surface, as well as the location and elevation of surface features. Now, each line on a topographic map represents a point of equal elevation, and these lines are called contour lines. Using the information on a topographic map, it is possible to create what's known as a topographic profile or a side view of an area. You have some experience of this in your lab activities for the Topographic Map Lab. I hope you found something in this lecture to be helpful. If you have any questions, please send me a message. Look forward to seeing you in Chapter 10.